All right, so long day for me. Doing a lot of talking, a lot of reading, but it's very, very, very important. While Russia and the United States have now been promising Israel peace and safety, peace and security, today, 5 hours ago, I believe it was, I will go ahead and read from Haaretz. Israel passes controversial Jewish nation-state bill after stormy debate. 62 lawmakers vote in favor of the bill after a stormy protest. Arab lawmakers tossed out after they tear the bill in protest, calling it apartheid law. Israel passed early Thursday a controversial bill that officially defines Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people, finally, and asserts that the realization of the right to national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people, sparking outrage from the Israel's Arab community and provoking concern from the international community. 62 lawmakers in Israel's Knesset voted in favor of the legislation and 55 opposed it. 2 lawmakers, Benny Begin, Likud, and Orly Levy Abekassis, independent, abstained. The nation-state law also includes clauses stating that a united Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and that Hebrew is the country's official language. Another says that the state sees the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. It passed after long and stormy debate that began in the afternoon with lawmakers voting on hundreds of clauses presented by the opposition that objected to different parts of the bill. Immediately after the law passed, Arab lawmakers tore copies in protest and were subsequently removed from the Knesset plenum hall. Lawmaker Ayman Odeh, chairman of the Joint List, released a statement saying that Israel declared that it does not want us here and that it had passed a law of Jewish supremacy and told us that we will be second-class citizens. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to the statement that Benjamin Netanyahu said. I hope that those of you who are listening can read between the lines. Speaking moments after the bill passed into law, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, "This is a defining moment." Listen carefully, folks. Long live the state of Israel. That is a term used for kingdoms, is it not? In Europe, they would always say, "Long live King Richard," or "Long live King that." Right? So he says, "Long live the state of Israel." How about "Long live the kingdom of Israel"? How about that, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu? Netanyahu further stated that the 122 years after Herzl made his vision known, with this law we determine the founding principle of our existence. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and respects the rights of all its citizens. The Prime Minister also said that in the Middle East, only Israel respects rights. This is our country, the Jewish state. In recent years, there have been those who have tried to undermine that and question the principles of our existence. Today, we have made it into law. This is the country, the language, the anthem, and flag. I will stop at this point right here and then move on to something. Wait a minute, what do we have here? Yes. On the Jerusalem Post, Turkey denounces Israel's Jewish nation-state law as racist, racist, racist. Ankara, Turkey accuses Israel on Thursday of trying to form an apartheid state and denounced as racist a new law declaring that only Jews have the right to self-determination in the country. A spokesman for President Tayyip Erdogan called on the international community to react to this injustice happening in front of the entire world's eyes after Israeli Knesset passed the nation-state law on Thursday, angering members of the country's Arab minority. Now, I have to say that this is a momentous occasion for Israel, for the Jews. And I want to then go to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And this is why Israel, or the state of Israel, must be the Jewish state, as they say. And it's backed up, folks, in Scripture, where it talks about how there shall not lack a lawgiver. What is it? I have to go look that up. There's another scripture talks about how all the other tribes of Israel are going to have to come to Judah. Okay? And Yehuda will, in Jerusalem, be over all the other tribes of Israel. But that would be another on another video. So I will start the expulsion of the Jews from Muslim countries, 1920 through 1970, a history of ongoing cruelty and discrimination. The Arab countries want to talk about cruelty and discrimination. Between 1920 and 1970, 900,000 Jews were expelled from Arab and other Muslim countries. The 1940s were a turning point in this tragedy. Of those expelled, 600,000 settled in the new state of Israel and 300 in France and the United States. Today, they and their descendants form the majority of the French Jewish community and a large part of Israel's population. In the countries that expelled Jews, a combination of 6 legal, economic, and political measures aimed at isolating Jews in society were instituted. Denationalization, legal discrimination, isolation and sequestration, economic despoilment, socioeconomic discrimination, and pogroms or similar acts. It is the custom to say that Zionism was responsible for this development. However, the region's anti-Semitism would have developed even without the rise of the State of Israel because of Arab Islamic nationalism. Oh, we have that word, Arab Islamic nationalism. You see, the hypocrites accuse Israel of what they do themselves. Islamic nationalism, which resulted in xenophobia. The fact that these events have been obscured has served in the campaign to delegitimize Israel and therefore, to a large extent, the same population that suffered this oppression. The fact that, or the fate of Palestinian refugees, their proclaimed innocence, and the injustice they endured formed the main thrust of this delegitimization. The Jewish refugees have suffered more than the Palestinian refugees and undergone greater spoliations. However, they became citizens of the countries of refuge, especially Israel and France, while Palestinians were ostracized from the Arab nations. More hypocrisy. Between 1920 and 1970, 900,000 Jews were expelled from Arab and other Muslim countries, from Morocco to Iran, from Turkey to Yemen, including places where they had lived for 20 centuries. The 1940s were a turning point in this tragedy. Of those expelled, 600,000 settled in the new state of Israel and 300,000 in France and Canada. Today, they are descendants, form the majority of the French Jewish community and a large part of Israel's population. How does one explain this exodus? It is the blind spot of contemporary political consciousness and an object of denial. There is not even an expression to name this major event. The forgotten Exodus is the most commonly used term, but it actually masks the nature and impact of this historical event. Forgotten by whom? Other ideologies? Exodus is an apt description of the situation, but not of its causes, which the adjective forgotten occults even more. For those who underwent the expulsion have not forgotten it at all. Moreover, it is also an important historical fact. This is a major transnational phenomenon. Jewish communities were expelled either in their entirety or almost in their entirety. Communities of some significance remain in Iran, Turkey, Morocco, and in Tunisia. All the countries that expelled Jews have one thing in common. They belong to Islam, including Turkey and Iran, which are not Arab countries. However, it is hard to view this exodus as a whole. It largely took place over a 30-year period, 1940 through 1970, and covered a huge geographical area, from Morocco to Iran, from Turkey to Yemen. Now, this section is called the Statutes of the Jews. Nevertheless, if one compares the facts of the various countries, an identical model emerges. Jews were systematically expelled after a de facto statute of the Jews was instituted. A combination of 6 legal, economic, and political measures aimed at isolating Jews in society was instituted. Denationalization, legal discrimination, isolation and sequestration, economic despoilment, socioeconomic discriminations, pogroms, or other similar acts. Number 1, denationalization of the Jews. And that right there, that one really burns me. Because I have had Christians, people tell me, I've even had Jews tell me that Jews is not a bloodline, it is a religion. That is utter nonsense. Jews are Jews who are descendants of one of the sons of Jacob, Yehuda. That's where the Jews were named after. It is genetic. It is passed down from generation to generation. It is not the religion. So, that lie is a part of the denationalization of the Jews. And anyone who participates in that lie are just like those Muslims who tried to denationalize the Jews. All right. So under the denationalization of the Jews were isolated from their society by a legal process in many lands. This was the preliminary stage of their exclusion, which was followed by expulsion. A number of legal measures in various countries illustrate this point. In Egypt, the most articulate evolution occurred. It began with the Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, a peace treaty between the Allies and the Ottomans that dismembered the Ottoman Empire and opened the way for further creation of Arab and Israeli states. It addressed the questions of nationality in Egypt and can be considered the first infringement of the rights of autochthonous Jews. I don't know what that word means. The notion of belonging to a race, Article 105, rather than a nation, was introduced, thereby disassociating Jews from a majority of the population of the country. The next step was the nationality laws of 1927 and 1929, which favored jus sanguinis, or right of blood. An Egyptian was from then on defined as somebody who had Arab Muslim affiliation. The London Convention 1936 granted Egypt independence under King Farouk, and it was followed by a worsening of the nationality laws. According to additional nationality laws in 1950, 1951, 1953, and 1956, the right of blood Jews became stateless. 40,000 people were turned into foreigners in their own country. In 1956, after the Sinai War, where the dimension a new dimension was added. Egyptian nationality was taken away from anyone who committed acts in favor of enemy states or states with no relations to Egypt. In practice, all Jews were suspected of dual loyalty. This led ultimately to the accusation that all Jews were Zionists. In Iraq, by the law of the 9th of May, 1950, Jews who left Iraq were stripped of their nationality. So even if they left on vacation or for any reason, they were stripped of their nationality. In Libya, the nationality laws of June the 12th, 1951, Article 1, Clause 27, decreed that the personal status of non-Muslims would be governed by their religious courts in the manner of dhimmis according to the pre-modern period. Jews were no longer allowed to vote or hold political office. Number 2, legal discrimination. A number of legal measures imposed restrictions on businesses and associations. Jewish communities and organizations were placed under supervision. Arabic became the sole language of public services. In Libya in 1953, Jews were subjected to restrictions, became victims of economic boycotts. The Maccabee Sports Club was forcibly opened to Arab members in 1954. A decree was issued on the 9th of May, 1957, obliging Libyans with relatives in Israel to register at the Libyan boycott office, even though at that point 90% of the Jews had already left. On December 3rd, 1958, Tripoli's Jewish community ceased to be an independent entity. Thereafter, it was overseen by a state-appointed commissioner. Legal exclusion worsened. In 1960, Jews were prohibited from acquiring new possessions. Did you hear that? They were no longer allowed to vote, hold public office, or serve in the army or police. On the 2nd of April 1960, Alliance Israelite University schools were closed. Similar developments occurred in Lebanon. As early as 1947, Jewish students were expelled from Beirut University. Jewish Zionist organizations such as the Maccabee Sports Club were forbidden. Jews were discharged from public service positions and Jewish youth movements banned. In Iraq, Jewish history and Hebrew language instruction were prohibited in Jewish schools during the 1920s. Jews were expelled from public service and education in the 1930s, and Jewish school curricula were censored in 1932. In Iran, Zionist activities were banned. In 1979 and 2000, discrimination developed in public service, universities, and public companies. In Yemen, Sharia law was instated in 1913, worsening the situation of the dhimmi. Decrees specified forced conversion for orphans were issued between 1922 and 1928, while Jews were excluded from public service positions and the army. In Syria, real estate purchase was prohibited to Jews in 1947, and Jews began to be discharged from public service positions. In 1967, Muslim principals were appointed to Jewish schools. In Morocco, after independence in 1956, a process of Arabization of public services began, cutting the Jews off from the larger society. A decree Moroccanizing Jewish charitable organizations was issued in 26 November 1958, endangering their freedom. In Egypt, a long process of discrimination in the public service began in 1929. In 1945 through 1948, Jews were excluded from public service. In 1947, Jewish schools were put under surveillance and forced to Arabize and Egyptianize their curricula. Community organizations were forced to submit their member lists to the Egyptian state after May 1948 and until 1950. In 1949, Jews were forbidden to live in the vicinity of King Farouk's palaces. In Tunisia, a law concerning Judaism, 11 July 1958, put an end to Jewish communities, replacing them with temporary Israelite worship commissions, and suppressed the personal status of the Jews inherited from the dhimmi status, which obliged the Jews to depend on their religious tribunals for all matters related to their personal status. In Tunisia, too, independence 1956 led to the Tunisification of public services. Turkey, under the Young Turks, 1923 through 1945 created hard labor battalions for non-Muslim conscripts in May 1941. Now, number 3, isolation and sequestration. Administrative harassment pushed the Jews into a state of isolation. The refusal to deliver passports, holding passports hostage, various boycotts by the Arab League, and the interruption of postal relations with Israel created a difficult atmosphere. Jews became de facto prisoners. For example, in July 1948, Iraq prohibits Jews from leaving the country. By a new nationality law, June 12, 1951, Libyan Jews were not allowed to have passports or Libyan nationality certificates, but only traveling documents whose renewal was not automatic. Postal relations with Israel were suspended in 1954. Emigrating to Israel was restricted. Tourism to Israel banned. Yemen prohibited Jews from leaving the country in 1949. Tunisia stopped postal relations with Israel in 1956. In 1973, Syria forbade Jews to communicate with people abroad. In Morocco, too, starting in 1956, there were difficulties for Jews obtaining passports, families held hostage. In 1958, personal relations with Israel were suppressed. In Iran, it became difficult for Jews to obtain passports starting in the 1980s. In Egypt, in the 1950s, passports were also taken away from people leaving the country. In June 1948, martial law banned Jews from leaving Egypt for Israel. Now, number 4, economic despoilment. Jewish economic assets were also targeted. Their liquid assets, bank accounts, and property were submitted for sequestration and nationalization, held for ransom, and stolen when they departed. And I personally know of such a story. In Turkey, capital taxation was imposed only on Jews in 1942. Iran confiscated Jewish possessions and real estate in 1979. Morocco held Jews anxious to emigrate to Israel for ransom in 1961, and the World Jewish Congress had to pay $250 for each Jew who was permitted to leave the country. In Tunisia, in 1961 through 1962, Jews who were leaving the country were allowed to take with them only 1 dinar with them. That's equivalent of $3 US. Yemen, in 1949, issued Jewish possessions or listed Jewish possessions and properties in order to hold them for ransom. In 1947, Syria discharged Jews from public service positions. In 1949, it seized Jewish financial assets. Syria enacted a law to seize Jewish possessions, houses, estates, and shops in Aleppo and in Qamishli in April 1950, and to settle Palestinian refugees in Jewish quarters. From 1958 to 1961, Jews leaving the country were forced to transfer their possessions to the Syrian state and to pay considerable departure expenses. In 1960 and 1975, a Canadian Jewish sponsor paid a ransom to get people out of the country. In 1967, Jewish workers were fired in order to hire Palestinians, and Jewish doctors and pharmacists were laid off. In Libya, in 1961, Law Number 6 decreed that the possessions of the Jews leaving for Israel to be sequestrated. A general registrar was put in charge of liquidating them. In 1970, Jewish properties were confiscated. In Iraq, considerable fines were imposed on wealthy Jews in July 1948 and in March 1951. The possessions of the Jews leaving the country were frozen, and the Jews were obliged to give up their citizenship. In Egypt, in February 1949, the possessions of autochthonous Jews and those who were abroad were sequestrated. Number 5, socioeconomic discrimination. Furthermore, the Jews suffered socioeconomic discrimination in Muslim and Arab countries. In some cases, companies were made into cooperatives so that Jewish entrepreneurs lost ownership. In Iraq, the Law of 12 January 1950, concerning bank control, led to bankruptcy of stockholders, most of whom were Jewish. Syria prohibited Jews from working in agriculture in February of 1950. In Libya, a ban against employing Jews in petroleum companies was instituted in the 1960s, starting in the 15th of July 1961. A nationality certificate was required for every commercial action, but the Jews could not obtain one. In Morocco, starting in 1950, in 1960, Jewish entrepreneurs and businessmen were obliged to have a Muslim partner. The same development occurred in Tunisia in 1956. The national economy, industry, and trades became cooperative, and Jewish entrepreneurs and businessmen were obliged to have a Muslim partner. In Egypt in 1947, a law concerning companies decreed the Egyptianization of public and trade affairs. 75% of employees had to be real Egyptians, aka Arab or Muslim. It was, in fact, an Islamization of personnel so that the majority of Jews would lose their jobs. In 1948, the Yemeni ruler Imam Ahmad obliged Jews to pass on their expertise in crafts and trade to Yemeni Arabs before leaving the country. Okay, so the last one is pogroms and related events. A series of pogroms and related events such as riots, arrests, murders of public figures, and destruction of synagogues occurred while colonial powers and Arab state police looked on passively. That gave the Jews a signal it was time to leave. In Egypt, anti-British and anti-Semitic riots broke out in several towns on the 2nd and 3rd of November in 1945. Massive arrests occurred in 14th through the 16th of May in 1948, 1,000 Jews were detained and accused of being Zionists. On the 2nd of November 1948, riots and looting took place in Cairo, and on the 26th of January 1952, Black Saturday saw riots and acts of violence. In Turkey, on July 1934, pogroms occurred in Thrace. In Iraq, on the 1st and 2nd of June 1941, in Farhud pogrom in Baghdad, 180 people were killed and 600 injured. In 1948, a wave of official anti-Jewish persecutions, including arrests and considerable fines, took place. Shafiq Hadas, a Jewish millionaire who was accused of selling surplus military stockpiles to Israel, was executed in September 1948. During 1949, Zionist movement members were persecuted. Persecution also took place in Kurdistan in June 1950, when Jews were obligated to give up their possessions and houses. The synagogue was attacked in Baghdad on June 14, 1950. 3 people were killed and 20 injured. In Libya, riots against those living in Jewish quarters occurred in Tripoli. In January 1945, 60% of the Jewish possessions were destroyed and 135 people were killed. Soldiers acted as accomplices to the rioters. Jews were forced to evacuate. Jews in Harar, Tripoli, and Benghazi were put on remand. In 1948, there were more riots. An 84-year-old Jewish leader, Hafala Nahum, was murdered in Tripoli in 1963. During the summer of that year, other Jewish figures were attacked and injured. In 1967, riots broke out and 10 people were killed. In 1969, an anti-Semitic campaign was initiated against the Jews, and Jewish cemeteries were razed in 1970. 64 synagogues were destroyed in 1978. 78 synagogues were transformed into mosques, or in the case of Benghazi, into Coptic churches. In Lebanon, Jews were kidnapped and murdered during 1967 following a series of kidnappings and murders of Jews. The murder of one of them, Dr. Albert Elia, in September 1971, signaled to the Jews that it was time to depart. In Iran, a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism occurred in 1968, in 1979, and 1980. Habib Al-Kanian, chairman of the Jewish community, was accused of Zionism. He and other Jewish community figures, Abraham Rohim, Albert Daniel, and Manustar Kedokim, Kedoshim were executed. In Syria, pogroms took place in several towns, synagogues were torched, and several hundred Jews were arrested in November 1947. The Al-Manesha synagogue in Damascus was attacked on the 5th of August 1949. 13 people were killed and 32 injured. In Algeria, in 1929 to 1930, many incidents between Arab and Jews occurred in several towns in the Constantine area. On the 5th of August 1934, a pogrom in the name of jihad took place on Constantine. 27 people were killed, but the soldiers did not intervene. In 1957, there were murders in Oran and Medea. In March 1958, grenades in Bulgaria, and the day before Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, in 1959, grenades in Ba'u Sa'ada. The Algiers synagogue was ransacked on the 12th of December 1960. In 1961, the Oran Jewish community was desecrated, and famed musician Raymond Leiris was murdered in Constantine. On the 2nd of September 1961, a Jew was murdered on Rosh Hashanah. In Oran, especially in the Jewish quarters, murders and massacres were perpetuated on the 5th of July 1962, the very day of Algerian independence. In Tunisia, in January 1952, riots occurred in the ghetto of Tunis with one person killed. In 1956, attacks on the Jews took place at night. The old Tunis Jewish cemetery was expropriated in 1957, and the Great Tunis Synagogue was destroyed in 1960. Violent acts were perpetrated after the Bizerte affair of July 1961, in which Jews were accused of having fought alongside French troops during a bloody clashes between Tunisian and French troops around the French military base. A wave of departures of Jews ensued. 15,000 in 1961, 10,000 in 1962, all fled to France. The Tunis Jewish quarter was plundered on 6th of June 1967, and the Great Synagogue was ransacked. Jews were murdered in the Jerba in 1982, and the Jerba Synagogue was attacked on the 11th of May in 2002. And this goes on to pogroms in Morocco, pogroms in Yemen as well. Now they say the causes. Anti-Semitism would have developed even without the existence of the State of Israel because of Arab Islamic nationalism, which resulted in xenophobia. I'm going to stop right here because my whole point of this video is about the Israel nationalism law and the hypocrisy of the Arabs who committed all these atrocities in the name of nationalism against the Jews in their own countries, just like the European Christians did. And so for any of these countries, whether they are Euro-Christian or Arab, Muslim, whatever, if any of them accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, racism, and all this other sort of garbage, you all are a bunch of flaming hypocrites, every one of these nations. And so I say to Israel, long live the kingdom of Israel in Jerusalem.